The sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills, casting a golden hue over the quiet neighborhood. The faint sound of children laughing echoed through the streets as families began to retreat into their homes. Amid the calm, a young boy, no older than 8, wandered just beyond the safety of his backyard. He wasn't alone, though. His loyal dog, a scruffy, medium-sized mutt with a heart as big as the open sky, was right by his side. They were inseparable, a bond stronger than words could ever capture. To anyone watching, it seemed like an ordinary evening. But what unfolded next would be anything but ordinary. The boy, lost in the excitement of exploration, ventured further than usual, his laughter mingling with the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. His dog, ever watchful, followed closely, tail wagging and ears alert. The pair had no way of knowing that something unexpected was waiting just ahead, a situation that would test their trust, courage, and loyalty in ways no one could have predicted. A faint noise in the distance caught the dog's attention. His body stiffened, his playful demeanor replaced by a protective stance. The boy, oblivious to the shift, continued forward, a stick in hand as he poked at the ground. But the dog knew better. There was something out there, something unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. The air grew still, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. The dog let out a low, guttural growl, his instincts kicking in. He positioned himself between the boy and whatever lay hidden beyond the thicket of trees. The boy paused, sensing his companion's unease, and turned to look at him. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. And then, it happened. A rustling in the bushes. A shadow moving too quickly to identify. The dog barked, loud and sharp, a sound that seemed to cut through the quiet evening like a warning bell. The boy froze, clutching the stick tighter as his heart began to race. In that moment, the dog made a decision. Without hesitation, he darted forward, his movements swift and deliberate. Whatever danger was lurking in the shadows, he wasn't going to let it near the boy. Not on his watch. What happened next was a blur, a mixture of barks, growls, and a sudden commotion that sent birds scattering into the sky. The boy stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear and confusion as he watched his brave companion face the unknown head-on. As the dust settled and the echoes of the commotion began to fade, one thing became clear: this wasn't just any ordinary evening. The boy's loyal friend had just proven that love and bravery can shine even in the darkest of moments. But what exactly had the dog confronted? And would they both make it back home safely? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss, a story about courage, love, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. The boy's breath came in short, nervous bursts as he stood frozen in place, clutching the stick like it was some sort of shield. His dog, normally playful and full of boundless energy, was now a different creature, entirely focused, alert, and bristling with courage. The growls rumbled deep in his chest, an unrelenting sound that filled the boy with both fear and an odd sense of comfort. The bushes rustled again, and the boy's eyes darted toward the noise. He could barely make out a shape, a shadow that seemed too big to be a raccoon or a stray cat. He took a hesitant step back, but his dog didn't budge. Instead, he barked again, louder this time, a sound so commanding it seemed to echo into the woods. The boy's thoughts raced. What if it was a wild animal? He had heard stories about coyotes wandering close to town, especially in the evenings when everything got quiet. His parents had warned him not to go too far past the fence, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, standing there with his loyal dog acting as his protector, he regretted not listening. A sharp snap of a twig broke the tension, and the shadow moved again, this time faster, darting from one side of the bush to the other. The boy's dog lunged forward, barking furiously, his body tense and ready. The boy wanted to call him back, to grab his collar and run back toward the safety of home, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. "Come back!" he finally managed to yell, his voice shaking. But the dog didn't listen. He was on a mission, and whatever was in those bushes wasn't going to get past him. The boy took another step backward, his eyes fixed on the spot where his dog had disappeared into the underbrush. The rustling grew louder, and then silence. For a moment, the only sound was the boy's own heartbeat, pounding in his ears like a drum. "Buddy?" he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The seconds felt like hours. Just as he was about to call out again, the bushes parted, and his dog emerged. He was unharmed but clearly rattled, his tail low and his ears pinned back. He walked straight to the boy, pressing his body against him as if to say, "It's okay now. I'm here." But the boy could tell something was still wrong. His dog kept glancing back at the bushes, his eyes darting nervously. Whatever had been out there hadn't gone far. The boy crouched down, wrapping his arms around his dog's neck. He could feel the rapid thumping of his heart, the warmth of his fur. "What was it, boy?" he murmured, his voice trembling. The dog didn't respond, of course, but his actions spoke volumes. He stayed close, never taking his eyes off the darkening woods. The boy decided it was time to go home. He stood up, gripping his dog's collar tightly as they began the slow walk back toward the yard. His legs felt like jelly, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at him. By the time they reached the safety of the house, the boy felt a wave of relief wash over him. The warm lights from the kitchen spilled onto the lawn, and he could hear his mom calling for him. "There you are," she said, her tone a mix of relief and mild irritation. "I told you not to wander off too far." "I know," the boy replied, his voice quieter than usual. He didn't mention what had happened, not yet. He wasn't even sure how to explain it. That night, as he lay in bed with his dog curled up at his feet, the boy couldn't stop thinking about the shadow in the bushes. What had it been? Why had his dog reacted the way he did? The question swirled in his mind, keeping him awake long after the house had gone quiet. His dog seemed restless, too. Normally, he would be fast asleep by now, snoring softly, but tonight he kept lifting his head, his ears twitching at every little sound. The boy reached down, stroking his fur in an attempt to calm both of them. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it. The night stretched on, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and the boy thought he heard the faint rustle of leaves. He told himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, the boy was unusually quiet at breakfast. His mom noticed, of course, but she didn't press him. She figured he was just tired from staying out too late the night before. But as the day went on, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of their yard. He found himself watching the woods, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. His dog seemed to share his unease, sticking close to him and growling softly whenever they ventured outside. The boy decided he needed answers. He couldn't go back to the bushes alone, it was too risky. But maybe he didn't have to. Maybe there was another way to figure out what was out there, something that didn't involve stepping into the unknown. As he sat on the porch that afternoon, the boy hatched a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't exactly safe, but it was the only thing he could think of. With a little bit of courage and a whole lot of faith in his furry companion, he was determined to uncover the truth about what had happened the night before. What he didn't know was that the truth would be far more surprising and far more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. The boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Despite the sunlight now pouring down and warming the yard, the unease in the pit of his stomach never seemed to fade. He spent the morning pacing the porch, eyes darting nervously toward the thicket of trees, his dog never straying far from his side. It was as if the dog, too, was waiting for something to happen. Around midday, the boy decided it was time to investigate. He couldn't keep wondering forever. If something dangerous was out there, he needed to know exactly what it was. With his dog close behind, he grabbed a flashlight and a small backpack, just in case. The woods beyond the fence loomed larger than ever before, and for a moment, doubt crept in, but he shook it off. His dog had protected him before. He trusted him completely. They walked toward the edge of the woods, where the trees cast long shadows. The dog remained tense, his every movement sharp and calculated, ears pricked and nose twitching. The boy's hand tightened around the flashlight. The closer they got, the harder it was to ignore the strange feeling gnawing at him. They stopped just beyond the boundary of the yard. The bushes that had rustled the night before were now eerily still, but the boy couldn't shake the memory of how his dog had reacted. He scanned the area with the flashlight, heart racing, but found nothing. The woods were quiet, too quiet. But then, as the boy stepped forward, the sound of rustling broke the silence again. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. This time, it wasn't just a branch snapping or an animal moving through the underbrush. It was something different. Something heavier. The boy's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the tension rise, thick in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Before he could react, the dog lunged forward with a powerful bark, a fierce growl rising in his throat. The boy felt a sharp tug on his wrist as the dog pulled him back, away from the noise. The boy stumbled, barely staying on his feet. Whatever was out there had triggered the dog's primal instinct to protect, and it was clear the danger was real. The bushes parted suddenly, and out of the darkness emerged a large, shadowy figure. It moved swiftly, like it was stalking them. The boy's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought it was the same creature he had feared, a wild animal, maybe even a coyote. The shape was massive, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the dark. But then, as the figure stepped fully into the clearing, the boy's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't anything he had expected at all. It was a person. A man, tall and thin, wearing tattered clothes and a hood that obscured most of his face. His eyes glinted strangely in the light from the flashlight, and his presence felt unsettling, as if something wasn't right. The boy's dog growled fiercely, stepping between the boy and the man. "Stay back!" the boy shouted, his voice trembling. The dog barked again, more fiercely than before, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the boy. The boy's mind raced. Who was this man? What did he want? The dog was his shield, his protector, but even he seemed uncertain, his body tense, every muscle alert. "Is everything okay?" the boy asked, his voice cracking despite his attempt to sound brave. He didn't know why he asked. It was clear everything was not okay, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. The man tilted his head slightly, as though the question itself was strange to him. He took another slow step forward. "I don't want any trouble, boy," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Just need to get past." The boy stood rooted to the spot. There was something in the man's voice, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't believe the man. Not for a second. The dog growled again, more menacingly now, showing its teeth as it stepped forward, nearly forcing the boy to retreat. It was clear that whatever this man was, he wasn't welcome here. But the boy couldn't help but feel an odd sense of sympathy. The man looked tired, desperate almost, like someone who had been wandering for far too long. Suddenly, the man's eyes flicked toward the bushes once more, and in that instant, the boy felt a chill run down his spine. He followed the man's gaze and saw movement, something dark and massive shifting just beyond the trees. Before he could react, the man lunged forward with alarming speed, grabbing the boy by the arm, his grip like iron. "Run!" he shouted, urgency now in his voice. The dog, already alert, snapped at the man's hand, forcing him to release his grip. The boy yanked his arm back and, without thinking, bolted toward the safety of the yard. The dog was right behind him, the man's words of warning echoing in his mind. But as they neared the fence, the boy glanced back. The figure of the man stood motionless, watching them, his face hidden beneath the hood. And then, in a flash, he was gone, disappearing into the woods with an almost unnatural speed. The boy didn't understand what had just happened. His heart was still pounding, and his mind was racing. The boy didn't stop running until he was back in the safety of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. He was breathing heavily, still trying to make sense of what had just occurred. But the mystery wasn't over. The boy and his dog had escaped, but not unscathed. As they stood there, catching their breath, the boy noticed something he hadn't before, something in the dirt at the edge of the yard. A single, small item. A silver key. It glinted in the sunlight, as if waiting for someone to find it. The boy knelt down, picking it up slowly, his fingers trembling. What was this key for? And why had the man left it behind? One thing was certain, the story wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The key was a clue, and it would lead them somewhere the boy hadn't imagined. The boy sat on the porch steps, the silver key turning over and over in his small hand. Its surface was smooth, with an intricate pattern etched into the top, a design he couldn't quite make sense of. He held it up to the sunlight, watching as it glinted, almost as if it were alive. His dog sat beside him, calmer now but still alert, his eyes darting toward the woods every so often. The boy didn't know what to do. Should he tell his parents about the man, about the key? Or should he keep it to himself? Deep down, he felt like this key was meant for him, like it was part of some bigger story he'd been pulled into without understanding why. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the boy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the stillness unsettling. Even his dog seemed on edge, sticking close to him no matter where he went. By evening, the boy was exhausted, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. That night, as he lay in bed, the key sat on his nightstand, catching the soft glow of the moonlight through his window. He stared at it, turning over everything that had happened in his mind. The man's warning, the strange movement in the bushes, the way his dog had acted, it all felt connected, though he couldn't figure out how. He eventually drifted off to sleep, the key still on his mind. The next morning, he woke to find his dog sitting by the window, staring out toward the woods. The boy rubbed his eyes, stretching as he got out of bed. He walked over to the window, following his dog's gaze. The woods looked the same as always, but something about them felt different, almost as if they were calling to him. The boy knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed the key from his nightstand and slipped it into his pocket. His dog wagged his tail, as if sensing his decision, and followed him to the door. "Let's figure this out," the boy said, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. They made their way back to the edge of the yard, the morning air crisp and cool. The boy hesitated for a moment before stepping into the woods. His dog stayed close, his ears perked up and his nose sniffing the air. The boy didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt like he'd know it when he saw it. They walked deeper into the woods, the trees casting long shadows over the ground. The boy's heart raced as he glanced around, half expecting the man to appear out of nowhere. After what felt like hours, they came to a clearing. In the center stood an old, rusted lockbox, its edges covered in moss and dirt. The boy's breath caught as he approached it, the key in his pocket feeling heavier with every step. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt from the box. The lock was ancient, the metal tarnished and worn. His hands trembled as he pulled the key from his pocket, fitting it into the lock. It turned easily, the sound of the mechanism clicking echoing in the quiet woods. The boy hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, he found a small, folded piece of paper and a worn leather pouch. He unfolded the paper carefully, the edges brittle with age. The handwriting was shaky but legible, and the words sent a shiver down his spine. "Protect the boy. The danger lies within." The boy stared at the note, his mind racing. What did it mean? Protect him from what? He opened the leather pouch next, finding a small pendant inside. It was simple, with a symbol that matched the design on the key. The boy slipped the pendant into his pocket, feeling a strange sense of comfort as he did. His dog barked softly, drawing his attention back to the clearing. The boy turned to see the man standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. The boy stood up slowly, the key still in his hand. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. The man didn't answer at first. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said finally, his voice low. The boy frowned. "Why? What is this?" The man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's a warning," he said. "And a promise. There's something out there, something dangerous. That key, that pendant. They're meant to protect you. But only if you're careful." The boy didn't know what to say. He looked down at the pendant in his hand, its surface smooth and warm. "Why me?" he asked. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because sometimes, it chooses us," he said simply. Before the boy could ask anything else, the man turned and disappeared into the woods, his figure melting into the shadows. He didn't understand everything that had happened, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. As they made their way back home, the boy felt a strange sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers, but he had the key, the pendant, and his loyal dog by his side. And for now, that was enough.